Okay, well, today I get to introduce you to the multi-talented Nina Sadowsky, a native of New York and an entertainment lawyer in recovery, as she says. For most of her career, she has been a film and TV producer and writer, has served as president of Meg Ryan's production company, was executive producer for The Wedding Planner, and wrote and produced The First Year's a Bitch, a dark comedy about the first year of marriage, which won the award for Best Editing at the New York Short Film Festival in 2004. She also has taught writing and production for USC School of Cinematic Arts and much, much more. Nina's with us today because she's an accomplished author with 4 thriller novels, which include Just Fall, her first, which came out in 2016, The Burial Society, released in 2018, The Empty Bed, right here, which followed in January of this year, and her 4th thriller, Convince Me, was released in August. She's a member of the International Thriller Writers, Mystery Writers of America, and Sisters in Crime. Although Nina and I have not met personally, we share a mutual friend, Kathy Schaus, who introduced us via email back in July. And she helped me arrange for Nina to speak with us today on the topic of cliffhangers, twists, and pacing. Nina's impressive credentials could fill a book of their own, so I'm going to turn the Zoom spotlight over to our sister, Nina Sadowsky, and let you see for yourselves. Take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone. I just want to say by start off that it was, as a fly on the wall for your meeting. And it was really impressive how committed and engaged you all are with each other and the community. I really loved hearing that. I teach writing. I'm not at USC anymore. I was at the film school there for 12 years, but now I run NYU Los Angeles, which is a program for media and entertainment students here in LA. But I have been a teacher for a long time. And one thing I always say is that finding your community to help support you is one of the most important things that you can do. So it's great to see that you've got that. I also loved hearing about BoucherCon because I went to BoucherCon in NOLA with my first book. That was part of my Just Fall experience, where I also got to come to the Christamore Guild event in Indy, which really has led me to a great love for Indianapolis. And also I have to acknowledge for Kathy Schaus, who I refer to as my super fan, who just, we had a great story. I met her. She came. I had a launch of my first book at the Barnes and Noble here at the Grove in LA. Kathy was out here visiting her son, and she loves books. And so she happened to come in, and she liked what I had to say, and she bought the book. And then I was on this book tour, and I was in Indianapolis, and there was Kathy with a copy of my book asking me to sign it and telling me she'd seen me in Los Angeles. And I thought, if she shows up again, she's a stalker. Like, that's getting weird, But we just stayed in touch, and she's been a very loyal friend and supporter. And so I thank her for bringing me to you. We spent a great weekend with her daughter. This was also a great story. I came to Indy to promote the Burial Society, and Kathy, again, was very kind and helped me set up a lot of events, signings and library events, et cetera. And then we spent the weekend driving around in the freezing rain, talking about everything with her daughter. And, I say from that point, like, just crossed over into friends and haven't looked back. But anyway, so that's history. But now what I would like to do is unveil some mystery. That was so cheesy. Okay. So I, as Janice said, I just published my 4th book, which is called Convince Me. And that book was I just want to talk about it for a second. It was a book I wrote out of complete rage. The thematics of it are the terrible, divisive, and disintegrating effect that pathological lying and lying in general and this post-truth society is having on our culture. I wrote it in an absolute fury. It poured out of me. It was actually inspired not even by politics, which a lot of people assume, although that enrages me as well, but by a story in the publishing industry, in which a unrepentant pathological liar who was making money for people just kept getting rewarded and rewarded and rewarded. And I can't tell the story because my publisher cautioned me that I shouldn't be clear about who it was, but I can refer you just, look a couple of years back. And if you read the New Yorker, if you remember a story about an author who was a pathological liar, there's a clue. Anyway, so, but that book has been interesting, and I hope you'll pardon my language, because the dedication is, this book is dedicated, this book is for everyone who's sick and tired of the fucking liars and their fucking lies. And one thing that has been fascinating to me is that in the Kindle version, that dedication appears on the very last page instead of the front, like in the physical book. And people on Amazon and Goodreads are writing the reviews and saying, oh, and then I got to the dedication and I realized she wrote this book just for me. And I realized just how much that theme, which inspired me to write, which is what always inspires me to write, a theme, not necessarily this one, but a strong theme. I just realized how much it was resonating. So with that, I'm gonna start to share a PowerPoint. Am I enabled as the host so I can share? Is that done? Okay. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you. I do teach. I love to teach. And I actually taught a class this summer on thriller fundamentals. And so what we're coming in here is we're diving into the middle of that. But this is sort of the end of everything that I taught before in this class. And I just want to summarize, these are some storytelling standards that I rely on, and that are very important to just acknowledge as sort of the building blocks before you move on to the specifics that I'm going to talk about flow and pacing, cliffhangers and twists. So one thing that I strongly believe is that every story has to have both a universal theme and a personal telling. So a universal theme is something that's going to speak to a lot of people, right? So in Convince Me, pathological lying, and a personal telling. The book is not about the guy who inspired it, and it's not about the political climate. It's about it opens at the funeral of a man, no spoiler alert, a pathological liar. It opens at his funeral, and then we learn who he really was through the perspectives of his wife and his best friend and his mother, who he's just left in a heap of trouble, all of them. And they have to deconstruct who they believe this guy was and come to terms with this sort of personal reckoning of how they were duped by basically a con man. So that's what I mean is the universal theme. People are reacting to the theme of I'm tired of being lied to, but I told it through a very personal story. And I used 3 point of views to do that, which put a pin in that because that's going to reflect on something I'm going to talk about later with respect to pacing. The other thing is active and relatable protagonists. I joke a lot that I think that writing in its most reductive form is math, right? And this is the math, which because I'm terrible at math. That your job as a writer is to part one of the equation, create empathy for your characters, make them relatable, create ways that people are going to connect to them, plus put them in situations which are going to cause them anxiety, right? That's the second part of the equation. And what does that equal? That equals a catharsis when your character comes through the other side. And that is that is the empathetic journey that you're asking readers to go on with you, right? So I think that is in the most elemental form, that is your job as a writer, to invite people, I like to say, to invite them onto your river raft, take them out through the dock, over the narrows, through the shallows, up over the rocks, down the waterfall, deliver them safely in full control of the whole time, right? That's the anxiety part. And then the catharsis part is when you deliver them on the other side, safely on the other side. Another thing that I believe very strongly is that you reveal character through action. One of the very luxurious things about writing prose is that you can get into people's heads and sort of luxuriate there. But I think that one thing that I've learned through writing for film and TV is that the more you can reveal character through action and even description than through what people are saying and thinking, the more connection that that audience will have, that empathetic connection, more of that they'll have. So that's a whole other lecture that I do on character. But the other thing is both causability and plausibility of evolving scenes. Things have to be causal. Every scene must inevitably proceed the next, propel the next scene. It should be inevitable that it happens, and it has to be plausible, because as soon as your reader says, what, could that happen? Do I buy that? You've lost them. As soon as that they bump on anything, you lose your reader. You have to have conflict. You have to have stakes. Otherwise, why do we care? And you have to have a catharsis, as I said, which is the end result. Otherwise, your reader will feel nothing at the end. And a lot of stories tend to just end instead of concluding. And there's a real difference to that. The concluding part is making sure that all of the emotional challenges and stakes that you've set up for your characters are resolved. And then also make audiences work for it a little bit. Don't tell them everything. Again, that's a luxury you have in prose that I don't have in TV writing. And it's been a very good lesson from the TV side. Okay. So now I'm going to dive into the specific things that you asked me to talk about. So pace is the speed at which a story is told, not the speed at which the story takes place, right? So you could have a fast-paced story that takes 100 years to unfold, right? And you could have a terribly leaden story that takes a day to unfold, right? So that's the difference. And then the number of words needed to write about an event does not depend on how much time the event takes to happen. It depends on how important that moment is to the story. And I think this is always just a very good reminder to self. And, you know, a lot of my writing process is reminder to self, right? I have created all these things for myself, a character sheet that I use to create character bios for every character, a self-interrogation sheet that I use at the end of a draft to ask myself questions to try to get myself out of the weeds of writing and into the, you know, from a place of better perspective. I know Stephen King advises to put your first draft in a drawer for 6 weeks, which is a great piece of advice, but I've never made it longer than 3. So good for him. He can wait that long. I can't. Anyway, so I think that this is very important. It depends on how important that moment is to the story. And if you think about that, that will really help you gauge, well, do I need all this description of this room? I recently caught myself in this. In building the world of a character's office for myself, I'd spent a lot of time in the first chapter of this new book I'm working on, creating what her office looked like, because I had to have it in my head. But then I went back in and I realized, well, I'm learning, this is what I needed to do. It's not what the reader needs to know right now. What they need to know is, why do they care about her? And hearing about her neat office and the soothing colors she's picked and the big window, that's not making us care about her. So I shifted the scene around so that she's a therapist, so that you come in mid-treatment with a distraught patient. So you immediately are in her head as she's trying to figure out, you come into the scene now, she's got 7 minutes left in her session and a client who's out of control and clients waiting in the waiting room. And so immediately it's a much more active opening, right? So that's just an example there from my research. Okay, so pace is how fast or slow the story progresses, and flow is how smoothly it progresses. And flow is really how things connect, right? So the momentum of the story that precedes the scene informs the next one, and then of course the next one. And that's what I was talking about that kind of causability of scenes. This is what inevitably should happen next. And, you know, this is really, I think, one of the hardest parts of being a talented writer, you know, and it's a craft thing, because I should talk about that too. You can learn craft, you can't learn voice. Your voice is the thing you all automatically have. all craft is learnable, but don't ever walk away from your voice, because that's the most important thing. But anyway, so the scenes don't exist in isolation. And so like in my self-interrogation sheet, one of the things I ask myself to look at is the transition between each scene. Does the end of this scene in itself then provide a good jumping off point for the next scene? And I'll give some examples of that later. And really the balance is to keep the audience guessing. The point of, like, when I taught a screenwriting masterclass with Felicia Henderson, who's an amazing TV writer. She created Soul Food for TV. She's worked on The Punisher and Empire. You know, she's just fantastic. And she said something which I quote all the time now. She said, the goal of your first 5 pages is to get the reader to read the next 5 pages. And the goal of the next 5 pages is to get them to read the next 5 pages, right? And I thought that was such a great example of this balancing act. You don't want to withhold information so that people feel like, oh, come on now, but you want to answer questions as they arise and then maybe tease something else. Okay, so here are some tips for controlling pace. If you want to make something feel, active, use short sentences, snappy dialogue, terse chapters, and active language. I tend to write in the first person because to me it feels more active. And I think that's one of the techniques I use. I use short chapters. I tend to use short sentences, which again is something that comes out of film writing, because for when you're writing a script, it's largely just dialogue, right? And the action, most people don't read. Executives, even actors, they don't read the description. All that time that we take as prose writers constructing the world that we're walking into, when they're just reading a script, it'll get constructed eventually, right? But it's just a roadmap. So they keep it as minimal as possible. And you learn to capitalize words and, keep the language as brief as possible so you can capture people's attention. Sometimes I think I err on the side of making my prose too brief, right? But at the same time, I hear a lot that I have excellent control of pace. And so I think that's actually helped me. But then if you're not trying to create that, there are variations. You can slow down the action to give the reader variety. You can have a more sort of internal chapter, which is less about action and more about a character's internal journey. You can use show and then tell later, which is where, you leave a character, say, with a knife at their throat, and then you cut somewhere else. And we go, oh, well, we're going to have to find out what happened there. But one of the most important elements of this, I think, is controlling your sentence structure. It's really recognizing that, writing is granular, so that the individual sentences, which construct individual paragraphs and therefore the chapters, all of that, if you're looking at pace from all of those things, you can use every bit of that. You can use, active language, or you can use more passive language. It's all choice, right? But this is how you can use the craft and the elements that we have in our toolbox to give the reader variety. And therefore, as I said before, think about it, taking them on that river raft, right? So at some point, if it's all going over the rapids, it's unrelenting. If it's just idling in the shallows, it's boring, right? You need to have all of it. Okay, so I love this. This is a good tip, is to dole out information when necessary, crumb at a time. So after you write information, look back and say, does the reader absolutely need to know this now? Because we only need to know what we know at a given time. And I think this is one of the hardest parts about craft. You as the writer have to know everything, right? You have to know everything. It's when you choose to dole it out, that's really your art. I believe that you should get into each scene as late as into the action as you can, and get out of the scene fast. And frequently what I find, as I just gave with that example of introducing my therapist, I came in with no action. I came in a passive character sitting at a desk contemplating how much she loved her office. It was just so boring. I was ashamed of myself. But, at the same time, writing is rewriting. And I believe also the journey of every artist is sort of on the daily like this. I'm a genius. I'm an idiot. I'm brilliant. I'm a moron, right? So that's my journey, certainly. But I do believe that writing is rewriting. And if you can let go of a little of that self-punishment and just say it gets better every time I work on it, it'll be a more peaceful journey. Okay. So I am going to go into, I have another little separate piece about twists, but so I'm just going to touch on it here. But the ideal twist both surprises and satisfies. And this is where I mentioned earlier, one of my storytelling standards was about the events being causal as well as plausible. You know, if you have a twist that feels unearned, people check out. They're just like, screw that. I didn't see that coming, you know? And I had a really good example of this, not actually in a book I worked on, but a movie I produced that Kiefer Sutherland starred in called Desert Saints. And it was a funny little independent movie we made. And when we screened the first cut, people were irritated by it because there was a twist at the end that they felt there had been no clues to prior, and they felt like you cheated because you just showed us this character was not who we thought, but we had no clues before that. So it feels, you know, people were angry, right? And it was a really good object lesson. And what we ended up doing was recutting that film so that we made it non-linear, and we gave some hints about the character who shifts, so that when you came to look at things in a different light, once you came to the end of the movie, it actually felt satisfying. So that was a lesson I learned early on in my producing career, but a lot of what I've learned in making films and TV, or writing films and TV, because I've written far more and worked on far more as a producer than actually has gotten made. That's one of the great lessons from that part of my life that I apply to writing. Okay, so here are 4 elements of successful twists. They're both unexpected and inevitable, as I said before. There's an escalation of what preceded it, because if you have a twist and it's a letdown, what's the point of that? It has to be a twist that ups the ante in some way. And if you can, a revelation that adds meaning, right? Like, think about I am your father, right? The Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker scene. You know, I often refer to Star Wars, partly because the first Star Wars movie, and specifically the cantina scene, was what inspired me to go into film in the first place, inspired me to become a filmmaker. But I also just think it's a classic hero's journey. Those, you know, if you believe in the hero's journey story, which is a very powerful thing to lean into, if you think about that, that is a twist that adds a revelation that adds so much meaning, right? This is an orphan boy, and to discover that his greatest enemy is often his father, it makes you look at everything differently. So I think that's a great example of that, although there are obviously many. So, you know, twists have to feel earned. They can't come out of nowhere, and yet they have to surprise. That's our challenge. That's what we have to do. And I think that it's 2 sides of the spinning coin, if you think about it that way, that twists are constructed by what you reveal and what you conceal. So you have to know, and this is, I think, the hardest thing about writing mystery or thriller, is you can't not write to a conclusion. I mean, although I will admit that sometimes I've had a conclusion that changed in the course of the writing, when the characters took over and things began to just go mad. And that's my favorite part, was when it goes like that. But things changed, or when I got into a battle with my editor on one book about the ending, things changed. But she was right, although I was also right. So, but this is the point. If you can look at it as like, okay, I know both sides of the spinning coin, and the question is, which side am I going to show to my reader, and when? And that's, you know, and always, I would say, assume that you can get away with less. That will make them hungry to know more. So to build a twist, you want to manage your reader expectations. So if you think about it and doing it these steps, I'm going to do a build up, I'm going to do a misdirect, I'm going to do a reveal, and then I'm going to pay it off, right? That's the basic 4. I'm leading to this. Oh, I'm going to send you over here. Okay, cheat. All right. now I'm going to direct you over here. Again, you are the river captain taking everyone on this journey with you. And again, as I said before, and I can't emphasize this enough, the really important thing is that you surprise your readers without them feeling cheated. And that's the, you know, that is something I think that you learn as you just do it. Okay, so this is a good tip. In order to bury a twist, you create multiple alternate storylines and you build the internal logic of every one. You lay out the clues for all of them. And then the end result is that your misdirection makes even more sense after the reveal, right? So this is, I believe that so much of writing is pre-writing. And I'm going to digress into this just for a minute, because I think it's particularly important for suspense or thriller, is that so much of it is knowing where you're going in advance. It's my process, as I sort of alluded to before, is very much about deciding what theme I want to write about. For Convince Me, it was lying. For the book I'm working on now, Privacy, it's about it's sort of about three themes. It's about how much collective grief can we bear as individuals and societies, rather topical. It's about what the loss of privacy is doing to our culture, from everything from being in each other's homes through Zoom to Alexa listening to everything we say, to what we put on social media. And it's about the pervasive sense of violence that surrounds women and people of color in this country. And so, those are kind of, heavy themes, I know, but it's kind of heavy time. My goal as is with all of my books, to take relatively heavy themes and deliver them in a cotton candy speed beach read, which is, if you've read my books, and if you haven't, I hope you will. I think I'm successful with that. I talk about heavy things. And also on my website, and there are book club guides for all of my books, in which I also have questions. For example, with Convince Me, with the book about lying, I asked people to talk about, do you receive information differently if it's from someone you trust or find charismatic? Where's your own degree of comfort with lying? Is it the little white lie? Where have you told a lie that you thought was for the greater good? I want people to talk about the ideas, but I'm digressing. Sorry. Happens to me. Anyway, but I think that if you build the internal logic of each side of your twist and lay out the clues, right? It could have happened this way. It could have, but I know it happened this way. But if your could have happened is as strong as your did happen, then your misdirection will make even more sense after the reveal, and it'll feel even more satisfying. All right, so here are some tips for doing that misdirection. It's important to bury important clues in scenes that are directing the attentions elsewhere. And the way you can do that is really through two easy ways. One is action and the other is emotion. And a character in an emotional state might miss something that they can then remember later. Oh, I didn't realize I tripped over a flashlight that now I realize is a clue, right? Because I was just stumbling to get out of there, right? So that's an example of both action and emotion providing misdirection, where, oh, we saw that character stumble over the flashlight, but they didn't realize the importance of the flashlight until they were out of danger. You can use red herrings, which is, classic misdirection. Dead ends have people, and one very good way to also do it is character speculations. For example, I was working on a story in which a mother disappears, and a year later, her teenage son disappears. And the question, the questions are, was she kidnapped? Was he kidnapped? Did she come back? Had she disappeared herself and come back and decided to take her kid and reunite with her son, right? So there were all these, questions that a character raises. And the truth of it was that the son had just had bad news and had gone on a bender and gotten beaten up and was, in an alley, had nothing to do with anything. And that the mother had been murdered years before. Right, which we didn't know. She was just missing at the time of the story, right? So that's a classic example from my own work of, this is a TV show I'm working on, where character speculations push the reader down an alternative path. Could this have happened? Well, it might have happened. Oh no, this is what actually happened. And then this is another way, is to point a finger, to shine a light on something that convinces the reader it just can't be that obvious. And then it is that obvious. That's not my favorite, although, because it requires a real deft hand for the, and so I think it goes to tone, right? I think that kind of tone might work better in a cozy mystery, or, you know, something that's somewhat lighter than the darker stuff I tend to write. I don't know if you guys know this, but my sort of brand is cheerfully dark. I have a monthly newsletter that comes out. It's called Dispatches from the Cheerfully Dark Mind of Nina Sadowsky, because while I write incredibly dark things, I'm an incredibly cheerful person. So I'm trying to balance both. And I encourage you all to sign up for my dispatch on my website, because it's fun. Okay, so then you can also, this is my favorite thing, is to have an unreliable narrator. I love unreliable narrators. Convincing Me, my current book, has 3 unreliable narrators. You don't know who's telling the truth at any time, which was both really fun to write, and I hope it's really fun to read. But I mean, this is one of the great pleasures of prose, is the unreliable narrator. And I could talk a little bit about the kinds of unreliable narrators there are. I have a whole other presentation on this, but, you know, here are some examples, or like, The Girl on the Train, the Paula Hawkins book. She's an unreliable narrator because she's, you know, blackout drunk, right? So that's one way you can make it. You can make it someone with a mental illness. You can make it someone who's deliberately lying to the audience. And I have, in that lecture, I have examples of all of those. But I think that, it's a delicious tool to use, because you can really toy with a reader. And I think readers like to be toyed with. All right, so cliffhangers, which is something else I was also asked to talk about, pose big questions at the end of a chapter or section. And these are one of your greatest tools for propelling pace, because the cliffhanger makes the reader go, oh my God, I have to see what happens next, right? So they fall into 2 categories. One is usually a physical, an active situation. You're dangling off the cliff. Are you going to be able to get your character off the cliff? Or a shocking revelation comes to light, threatening to alter the course of the narrative. And that might be realizing that the person you were undercover with in Germany and Berlin is actually a German spy, right? That would be a great, sort of cliffhanger. That's confirmed, and then you cut out of that chapter. So those are cliffhangers. Those are things that make the audience go, oh my God, what's going to happen next? And that is what you want. So here are some tips for cliffhangers. You should start chapters with a sense of urgency. This is a place where you definitely want to use pacing. You want to keep your passages concise. You don't want to have too much description. And you want to blend your descriptive passages into your action. For example, instead of describing the cliff that your person is hanging from, you want to say, her fingers dug into the granite, her knees were scraping, right? You want to make it part of the urgency into the description, so that you see her and feel her dangling off that cliff, rather than just describing the cliff and saying there. So that leads to the next tip, which is staying grounded in the protagonist's sensory experience. You can go into the scene thinking, how are they feeling? Is their heart beating fast? Are they sweating? Are they breathing okay? Is anything hurting them? What are they smelling? Is their hearing heightened because of a sense of danger, right? Really think about the senses. Another tip is to find plausible ways to withhold key information. And for an example of that is narrating from the point of view of a character who can't get or doesn't know the information. Let me try to think if I can think of a good example of that. Okay, so one thing you could do, I'm making this all up as I'm going along, but if our woman who's hanging from the cliff, who has recently discovered that her partner is actually a German agent, I'm just going to combine all this together. If we have her from the cliff, and then we go back to the recently revealed partner who is waiting down the path for her, and he doesn't know that she's hanging from the cliff, and we are with that character while he, or maybe he or thinks he so he doesn't know, but something, even though he's the enemy, when he, so then if you follow him to her hanging by the cliff, that would be another cliffhanger, right? Will he rescue her? She's looking up at him. She's just learned that he is not who she thought he was, that he is the enemy. Will he rescue her? That's a double cliffhanger, right? So the active of her literally hanging from the cliff and putting her potential rescuer as a person she's just learned is a traitor, right? So that is a way of you trying to twist the expectations, and then you leave the reader hanging there, pun intended, going, oh my God, what's going to happen? Oh, sorry. I keep going backwards. Okay, so opening the chapter in the middle of a scene or as late as you can. I find frequently as a writer, we kind of, all of us kind of need something to get into the scene. And if you look at it later, you can lose it. Or open something with a question, an interesting fact, or a change of pace, a different perspective, something that's going to surprise the reader. It doesn't necessarily have to be as drastic as your character hanging from a cliff, but it could just be a subtle change in direction. All right, now we're back in headquarters with the people that are controlling these two spies, right? Change of pace. We're over there at that part of the story. Another thing that's really good is to use a pulse to remind the reader of lurking danger. That's, classic example of that is the literal ticking clock, right? That's the pulse, is the literal. And you can use flashbacks. I love telling stories non-linearly. This is not for everybody. Some people like to tell them and read them. Sometimes people say, why do you move around so much? I like it. I think that using flashbacks or flash forwards can really create a new source of suspense. And I think that where I tend to use them primarily, flashbacks, is in a way that adds something to the reader's knowledge of the character, something from their past that's going to inform also what's happening in the present. I think that's the best use of it, because then it has a double layer. It's also advancing what you're doing in your forward story. Okay, so that's 3-act structure. Do you want me to talk about that, or let me see what else I have here. I'm going to stop the share for a section. Are there any, just ask, are there any questions about anything that I talked about so far? No?
Yeah, I have a question. How do you decide when to use a flashback? To me, it's a difficult decision whether to use a flashback or some other means of getting that information.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because it's a really difficult thing. And, I feel like in a way, the question I always ask myself is, will this flashback enhance what is happening in the forward story? In my first book, Just Fall, which is a crazy book, I'm amazed anyone bought it. I'm amazed that book launched my career. I mean, I'm fond of it in the way of you are of, like, any child, but it's, just joking. I love my kids to pieces, but it's a weird book. And part of the reason it's weird is after years of writing in very codified structure for film and TV, when I decided I wanted to write a novel, frankly, because I felt TV was getting too ageist for me, I completely abandoned every rule about structure there was. So I wrote in alternating chapters entitled Now and Then, and the now chapters are all linear, and the then chapters are all nonlinear and are deep dives into the characters' paths. So that book was a book that intentionally used flashbacks as a way of telling story. I mean, that book is about a woman who on the night of her wedding discovers her husband is a contract killer, and she's told if she wants to save his life, he's been kidnapped, she has to go to the Caribbean and kill a man. Right. And so the large thematic question the book asks is, where and how will we compromise ourselves for love? And, and also we, in the course of the book, we take down a human trafficking ring because, as I said, I always got a social agenda working. But, that was a book that related to a lot of people, because a lot of people have felt that they've compromised themselves in the name of love, or what they thought was love, or, and I wanted people to ask, themselves, where is your moral compass, right? And so learning about those characters from their flashbacks was important. I mean, if you discovered you had married a contract killer, you'd kind of mostly be horrified, right? So part of those, and she is, but part of those flashbacks were revealing to the reader the horrific circumstances of his childhood and how he became who he was, so that we, along with her, could retain empathy for him and hope that they actually figured this out together, the two of them, right? So that in that story, use of all those flashbacks was incredibly important. So I tend to use it for that reason, when there's and most of my characters, I have to say, have awful complicated backstories that they've worked to overcome. I've sort of just realized now that seems to be a theme, but they're people who have really gone through some shit, and as a result have developed, special coping skills or special abilities. My Burial Society series, and there's 2 books in that series, is about a woman who lives off the grid and runs a private witness protection program for abused women, whistleblowers, anyone whose life is intolerable, right? And again, she's a character with a very tragic past who's motivated for justice because she carries the guilt of her mother's death in her. So figuring out, and her father made her complicit in her mother's death. So she had a very complicated childhood. So figuring out how and when to reveal those pieces of her backstory was really a challenge. And I'll tell you, when I wrote The Burial Society, I didn't really conceive it as a series. And it was my editor who said, I think this should be a series. And I had about 100 pages. That was all of my protagonist's backstory in that first draft. And she said that all has to go. And I said, well, we have to know something about her. And also that means I have to come up with another 100 pages of book, because now I'm really under. So we had this big battle about how much of her backstory to leave in and how much to take out. And when the first review of the book, and we battled all the way through to publication in a friendly way. I love her. But at the end, when a book came out, the first review came from NPR, which was very positive, and I was thrilled about that. But the first thing they said was, there's not enough of her backstory, but yet it leaves me wanting more. So I'm looking forward to the next book. So that, we kind of both were right. That's what I guess we learned. But that was really hard for me. And now I'm adapting those 2 books for television. And it's also hard because I'm also having to figure out, now looking at it, all right, I know they're going to want a show that can at least run 5 seasons. How do I dole out that backstory over 5 seasons in a way that the audience just doesn't feel frustrated, right? Or do I decide that we learn what we need to learn about her in the first 2 seasons, and that's all I can do, and then seasons 3, 4, and 5, we have to complicate her life in other ways. So that required me to look at all that same work I had done building a world and characters and both forward story and backstory, and put it really through a blender and look at it in a totally different light. So I know that's a very long-winded answer, Ross, but I think that the point I'm trying to make is, it really is what is going to serve your forward story the best.
Are your backstories always true? Are your flashbacks always true? That's what I meant.
I tend to, I do, as I said, I do like to play with an unreliable narrator, but another really great trick is dreams, because this is a little preview, but maybe I shouldn't give this away because this is from the book I'm writing now. But anyway, I'll tell you. In the book I'm writing now, I'm not really using flashbacks, but I am using 2 or 3 unreliable, well, 2 unreliable narrators. And one of them has dreams that we will come to realize are the truth, as opposed to what she tells people, which are the lies, right? So I'm using dreams that haunt her as a way of doing that in that instance, right? So I think I think what you do is I'm very surgical about it. And this is, something else that I just wanted to talk about a little bit, because I really believe this is really important about writing, is both the vertical and lateral thinking, right? So vertical thinking is all that structure and craft that we have, right? It's tropes and stereotypes and understanding structure and, knowing when you can lean into things. The lateral thinking, I think, is more the collective unconscious stuff. It's your authentic voice. It's what you bring as your personal lens. It's, that magic thing that happens when you're writing and the characters take over, right? And I think you need both. If you have too much vertical thinking, you lean into stereotypes, things can feel stale or unoriginal, right? If you have too much lateral thinking, things can feel aimless or impossible or implausible, right? So I think that writing is really trying to marshal those two kinds of thinking, and then everything else you have in your toolbox, which is, everything that you can learn about craft and determining what your particular style is, right? And like, learning like through reading, through talking to people, through coming to groups like this and figuring out what works for you. I share my methods and my theories and my thoughts, but this is just what works for me, right? And I think everyone's process is different. So what I always say is, if anything I offer you is helpful, take it and run. But if you got something better working for you, go for that too, with the caveat of, don't lose that voice. But again, it's a very individual decision. And I think, again, it's, if you ask yourself, how much does the reader need to know? Does the reader absolutely need to know this? A lot of what we think the reader needs to know is just what we need to know, not the reader at all. It's what we need to know. And then we dole it out. Yeah.
I'm curious, because one writer that I know from reading was Sue Grafton, who came up in some ways like you did through television and movies. And yet she was adamant, as I think one of her last interviews, she said that if her children ever sold the rights to the Kelsey Milhone series to be made into a movie or television, she would come back and haunt them forever. Yet you obviously have seemed to, you make reference to working on a treatment of one or two of your novels for a television series. So how would you compare the two? Do you have any trepidation about going into television or with your writing, or does it make you comfortable doing that?
It went the other way around. So I was a film producer. My background was, I have a weird life. So I have an undergraduate degree in dance and writing. So I considered myself an artist, basically. And then my parents said, I graduated college and they bribed me to go to law school. Like, good.
You can't make a living at that. Get something useful.
Right, exactly. So my father said, I'm a lawyer in recovery. My father said that he would pay for law school, pay for an apartment if I went to law school. And I had graduated college and I couldn't afford to move out of my parents' house. And I was shallow enough to take that deal. So I went and became a lawyer. But I knew I was an artist, right? So what ended up happening is I worked in legitimate theater in New York for a while at the Schubert Organization. And then I worked at a film studio. And I became a filmmaker. And the first film I made got into Sundance, which is, the big, golden brass ring in the film business. And, my most famous movie is probably The Wedding Planner with Jennifer Lopez and Matthew McConaughey. Seems to be a perennial favorite. But so I worked primarily as a producer because, I segued from artist to lawyer. And then because my parents sort of drumbeat in my head, if you can't earn a living as an artist, I became a producer because that was the business side of the artistry, right? It was only around 2006, I got divorced. I had 2 small kids. I didn't want to be away from them all the time, which I was as a producer. And so I switched. I had goodwill in the industry because I wasn't an asshole, which has always been my operating modality, just like my operating motto, just, don't be a jerk. And so I started to write and people would read me because they liked me. And so I started making money as a screenwriter, although I have yet to have anything produced that I've written. I've produced movies as a producer, but what I've written sold a lot, but haven't produced. And then, as I said, I began to feel kind of aged out. It's already a sexist business. And then I just meant, I had written a script about two teenage girls, and got a lot of meetings, 22. And I saw people's faces fall when I walked in the room because I wasn't a teenager. And I just was like, I can't do this. So I wrote my first book on Sundays. I just promised myself I'd do it for 3 hours a week, and took me a year and a half. But that's how Just Fall was born, because I had to reclaim my love of writing. It was purely personal. And then to my utter astonishment, as I said, because it's kind of a wacky book structurally, it sold at auction to Random House. And even more astonishing to me, then Starz bought it to develop it as a TV series. And so then I was back in the TV game. So that was, came full circle. The Burial Society and The Empty Bed, which are, the first two books in that series about, my badass avatar who goes around writing rights in the world while I march and go to marches and sign petitions. She's like my, my badass out there. Those two books I sold to ITV America, and that's I'm adapting that series for them now. And that's been really challenging. Because I had to merge the things I liked about the Burial Society and things I liked about The Empty Bed, which included a love interest for the protagonist and an antagonist for the protagonist that didn't exist in the first book. They wanted me to merge those two. And so it was probably the most difficult thing I've had to do, is like step out of these two books that were so in my head and figure out how to take these disparate elements that were from the two of them and make it one cohesive story. I just turned that in on Thursday, so we'll see how I did. I don't know. But it was quite an experience. But in response to your answer about the differences, I love book people. I love publishing. I love other authors. I love going to conferences. I love going to things like this. Hollywood is a vicious place. I'm so grateful I'm grateful for many things. But one thing I'm really grateful for is that I have this career as a novelist, and I also have a career as an educator. I started teaching during the last writer's strike in 2006. When was that? It was a long time. 2007, 2008, 2008. There was a Hollywood writer's strike, and I had just left my deadbeat husband. I had paid him a huge settlement. This is a true story. I paid him a huge lump sum settlement so I wouldn't be paying alimony for the rest of my life. I had two small kids. I said to him, "You're off the hook. I'll support them. Just go away." I did that. And I had switched to writing with some success, so I could be with my kids. And then the strike happened and the recession happened, and I went through all of my savings in a year. And all of a sudden, here I was, middle to upper middle class, white girl who had $100 in the bank and wasn't sure how I was going to feed my kids. So it was the most scary time I have ever gone through. And I hustled. I did everything. I took all kinds of crazy jobs. I got stiffed. I took a writing job for $2,500 that, under normal circumstances, I would have been paid, $15,000 for, and then they sent me a rubber check. I mean, it was just awful. But this is what led me to teaching, is I had been working. I had adapted Chelsea Handler's book, My Horizontal Life, and I was attached to direct it. And that deal fell apart because of the strike. But my producer on it was affiliated with USC, and he said, "Why don't you come teach a class?" And I did, and I taught in my time at USC, I oversaw probably 500 short films, and we won the student Oscar, the student Emmy, and got into Cannes. So I feel like I have the trifecta as a faculty person. I'm so proud of that. And teaching became this sort of unexpected other thing I am incredibly grateful for in my life. I have touched the lives of a lot of students. As I said, I run this program for NYU now, with students from all over the world who are interested in media and tech. I mean, it was pre-pandemic. Now we're all virtual, of course. But that's been that to me became such an unexpected gift. And it's true, you ask an author to write a blurb for you, they do it. John Gilchrist, I thought after I heard that, I'm going to have a lot to live up here in this, that he's coming. I got a little intimidated, but, like authors will do that, my friend Jenny Milchman, who's just a doll, we had books released within 2 weeks of each other in August, and we did a joint Facebook Live thing and promoted out, did dedicated newsletters to our respective audiences promoting each other's work. I mean, authors will just do that for each other because, as we were talking about beforehand, people who love books love all the books. They're not going to not buy your book because I bought my book. They want all the books, right? Either people are readers or not. In Hollywood, there's so few jobs for so many people who want those jobs. And, I'll tell you what shifted a little bit. It used to be that most of the writing jobs or good writing jobs were in features, and that's a very solitary role in the feature writer. You go off, you write, you turn it in, you get notes. Usually you're fired after 1 or 2 drafts because the director is considered the true voice of a feature. What's really bit shifted is that the advent of television and streaming, the writer is completely different in television. The writer is the key power. So when you see the executive producer on a TV show, that's the writer producer, and that is the most powerful credit. Whereas in film, the most powerful credit is the producer credit. That's who collects the Oscar. Whereas the executive producer is often someone who just found some financing or, had a more peripheral role. But at TV, it's completely different. The writer is the producer, the writer producer is king, and directors are functionaries who come in to shoot individual episodes after the executive producer or showrunner has set the characters, the tone, the look, all of that stuff, right? So writers and those writers in TV tend to hire each other. So it became a much more, communal thing that writers hire writers in television. So that has changed somewhat, but still I feel that the publishing community is just a nicer, more supportive, less cutthroat group of people. That was, again, long-winded because I'm chatty, but I hope I answered your question. I see there's some questions in the chat. Yeah, so I have an agent. Okay, so there was a question here. Do I have an agent? Have you always? What's the story behind that? And how the auction with Random House happened? Okay, so I will say this, and so I have sold every book I've taken to market. So that means 5, which makes me a very privileged person, God knows. But I will say this, when I took my first book to market, I had 20 years of work and relationships and goodwill built up in the entertainment business. So when I didn't tell anyone I was writing that first book because I didn't want people going, how's that book coming, and me having no answer, right? But when I finally was done with it and I gave it to a few friends, they were like, this is good. Can I send it to so-and-so, right? I didn't know literary agents, but I had friends that knew literary agents. So 3 were interested. I talked to them all. I really liked the now retired Emma Sweeney. I thought she was fantastic. And so I signed with her, and I had done tons of deals for other people. And, I say she who represents herself as a fool for a client. So not actually made my deals, but, I brokered a lot of deals for other people, but I didn't know anything about publishing, and I was completely nervous. So Emma told me she was going to take it out to auction, and that meant announcing whatever day of the week it was, a Tuesday, I think, that we were going to take offers till 5 p.m. and then the book was off the market. And like my stomach dropped out because I thought, well, what if nobody wants it? Like, then what happens? And then we're just dead in the water. It's all a year and a half of work, and it's going to come down to one day. Like, I was so nervous. So kind of luckily I was in at South by Southwest with students who I had overseen in a film competition who had won with a film down there. And so I was in South by on a bus with all my students getting calls during the course of the day as the activity happened. And I was on the bus when I sold it. It was, kind of an amazing moment, with all my students cheering for me. It was just great. This is something that I think really speaks to, so I think I'm incredibly lucky. I go sometimes to conferences and people say that they, had 72 submissions before they sold things, and I think you were going to hate me, right? You know, and that's when I refer back to the 20 years of hard work that brought me that access. But then it was really just a question of my editor and I fell in love. Kate Misiak. She was Lee Child's editor at Random, so she had a lot of clout. She and I really connected from our first phone call. It's why I sold it to her in the auction. She and I, just from the minute we spoke, just really got each other. As I said, it was her idea to make the Burial Society into a series. But I'll tell you, you know, the story, you know, really took an interesting turn this year, even before the pandemic, because two things happened. Kate got left Random in the Crown merger, after the Crown merger. And so suddenly I was in the middle of a 3-book deal at Random with no editor. And so that was resolved. I had a pretty good relationship with the publisher. And this is, again, one of my key tenets: be nice to everybody, you know. So I had heard the publisher of the my imprint was coming to LA because her daughter was interested in film school. And I took them out to dinner with my daughter. And that was probably one of the best investments I ever could have made in my future, because we developed a connection. And then when Kate left, they asked, I got to interview basically a couple of editors and choose who I wanted to work with. And I heard from other friends at the imprint that they were not given that courtesy, nor did they get calls from the publisher, right? And so this, again, I just always believe in launching a charm offensive wherever I go is basically just be nice to everybody. You never know where it's going to pay off. But anyway, so then I started working with this new editor, but this was before The Empty Beds, but The Empty Bed was written and edited. All we were working on was cover art, etc. And so like I was a little nervous because, you know, I had such a love affair with Kate and I didn't know how this was going to work out for me. So one thing that I did, you know, part of the reason I wrote Convince Me, as I said before, it was because of rage, you know, utter rage. But it was also because I thought I need to rebrand myself with my publisher. I have a book, I owe them a book in a 3-book series that I have now a different publisher and I have a different editor than when they bought that. They're not going to be invested in that book. I'm going to have to shake it up. So when I wrote Convince Me in this rage writing spiel that I had, this mad, you know, 4.5-month fury, I also hoped that it would really change their perception of me. And I will tell you that actually worked. And this is probably my favorite story of all time. Last year, on October 11th, which is my birthday, I was in Florence for my job with NYU, staying at Villa La Pietra, which is one of the most fabulous places I've ever been. My son, who's a college student, was studying film in Prague, and he come to spend the weekend with me. And I got the call from my agent while we were eating pasta together that I had sold Convince Me out of contract, which meant that we had offered them a first look at it at Random, and they had bought it. And she said to me, for a pretty good price. And she said, do you want me to go back and renegotiate? And I said, no, I'm in Italy eating pasta with my son on my birthday. It's not going to get better than this. Just close, right? It's like, there's no point. And little did I know that this year it would be, I thought to myself at the time, I will never have a birthday that tops that. And I have to say that I expected that, but I didn't think I would, you know, be quite where it is this year, locked in my house, you know, in the world upside down. So, you know, so the end of this story, and I'll just wrap this up quickly and then see if there's another question, is then, so I sold that book and big celebration, all happy, right? And then about a month later, my beloved agent told me that she had sold her agency to another company. And all of a sudden I didn't have an agent, and, you know, they wanted to sign me, but I wasn't sure. I didn't know these people, right? So I did go to New York. I met with the people that she signed to. I was courted very heavily by another agency here in LA. I let them sign me just for adaptations and television work. And I did end up signing with the company that Emma sold to, which is Folio Lit in New York. And so far, so good. You know, I sold this new book, Privacy, based on a pitch, you know, in the middle of lockdown. I know it was like right after the George Floyd murder, so that's about the timeline. of when I sold it, I felt incredibly grateful that they bought another book from me, with the downward pressure on everything right now. I'll admit I got less than I did for Convince Me. And it was kind of a take it or leave it offer. And I took it because I thought it was better to keep writing and better to have another book than to, try to, be a prima donna in a time where people are losing their jobs. And, there's also much needed resources that need to go for more inclusive representation in publishing. Those were the arguments given me, and I couldn't argue with those. I believe in both those things. So, if that benefits, the greater good, I'm all for that. So I think that even if you have an agent, it by no means it just doesn't mean that everything is set. I've had a lot of different agents in the course of my career, really only 2 in the course of my publishing career, but in the course of my filmmaking career, many, and they're all kind of useless. I like my publishing agents better. They actually get involved and do things. But I do have a manager who I partnered with about 3 years ago. And that's the first time I felt I really had a partner in my career. I think the differences in Hollywood managers are more interested in a long-term strategy for career development, and agents are by necessity just transactional. They get judged every week by what booking slips they bring into the meeting, the weekly meeting. And so it's their best interest to get jobs for the highest paying clients as opposed to develop clients. Managers develop clients, and that's why they can often be better allies for people. So I signed with new agents to sell Convince Me, but I'm ready to fire them already. Just it's like, as I say, I most of my deals have come. I sold Just Fall because a friend slipped it to a friend who was a producer. The Burial Society series, I ran into an old friend who was a producer at a party, and that's how she found out about it. So much more has happened in my career just because I've maintained goodwill in a community than because of agents that I'm, skeptical about them. So could I talk a little more about the complementary material generate, like podcasts, interviews, and guest writing pieces? Oh yeah. Okay. So, this is a great question, because one of the things that startled me the most about being a author was how much work was not about writing. So as I mentioned, I started doing this dispatch. I started doing it largely because when I went to Thriller Fest a couple of years ago, I guess it was 3 years ago, and the organization had paid for a marketing presentation, and the marketing people concluded that the 2 most effective ways of building an audience were this sort of face-to-face, I mean, that it wasn't Zoom to Zoom, but this sort of face-to-face connection, and newsletters, because it gave readers a sense of connection. So at the time I was kind of daunted by it, and I thought, why should I do a newsletter? What do I have to say? There's so many newsletters out there. Who's going to want mine? But Jenny Milchman, who I mentioned before, said, Nina, you do have something special. You have this behind the Hollywood curtain kind of aspect. And she said, and I think that would not only be interesting to readers, I think it would be interesting to other writers. So one thing that I did for the dispatch is I created, and I open this to any of you, if you have anything you want to promote, I have someone ask a question. I say, about Hollywood, it's under a section called Hollywood Decoded. And then I answer the question, and then I link out to, someone's new film or someone's new book, or, I've just used it to shine a spotlight on some of the faculty who teach for me. Last month, I showed an animator who's teaching the history of animation for us. I showed some of her work. Next month, I'm going to show a trailer for a new Sophia Loren movie that a good friend of mine did the music for, right? So I use it to highlight other artists. And I will tell you, it's been kind of an amazing thing. I've grown to a subscription base of about 8,000. I changed the line from cheerfully dark to my pandemic line, which is resolutely resilient. And often I send out a dispatch and I get a response just saying, thank you so much, because I really try to keep it as a way of light and connectivity. I recently hosted a short story contest. Then I published the 2 winners through the dispatch. I started making a lot of art during COVID and just as a way of relieving my own stress. So also in my website, there's a COVID art gallery. And then readers, I asked readers and they started sending in me their art. So you'll see there's art from readers if you want to go check it out. But send me your art, paintings, photography, whatever you're doing. So I try to really use my website and my dispatch to create a sense of community and opportunity for people. And then I started right before the pandemic doing a YouTube channel of writing tips, short writing tips, which I'm going to have to, I've just been like all of us just dealing with life, but I'm going to take that up again. Because the other thing that I do in the course of trying to release a book is I write a lot of essays and appear in a lot of podcasts. I think I've probably done maybe, a dozen to 15 podcasts in the promotion of Convince Me. And it's been really fascinating. I've been broadcast out of New York. As I said, I did something for Carmel Clay Library. I did something for Parnassus Books in Nashville, for Mystery Bookshop in San Diego. I've been all over the Rhode Island. I've been all over the Georgia. I've been all over the country from my house, which is one of the things I consider, COVID lemonade. And I write guest pieces. A couple of my favorites I've done for Crime Reads. I did one for Crime Reads about my totally surprising friendship with the former undercover head, former head of the undercover school for the FBI, who I met at Thriller Fest and became, I interviewed him for about 100 hours for The Empty Bed. And, here's this like gun toting, I'm like a hippie child. He's like this gun toting, law and order guy. And we have just become the best friends. And if I am ever in trouble, I am calling Dave. So I wrote an article for Crime Reads called Me and the G-Man. For this book, for Convince Me, I wrote a piece called Why Writing About Psychopaths Keeps Me Sane. And if you don't subscribe to Crime Reads or LitHub, Crime Reads is a subset, the crime subset of LitHub. I would urge you to do so. They have great pieces. And oh, I'm sorry, I got connected. It's Carmel. Okay, I got corrected on my my pronunciation. But anyway, so I do all this stuff, and I basically say yes to everything. But I'll tell you kind of a funny one is I could put in my category of COVID lemonade, is that I got a DM on Twitter from a guy who said, "Are you the Nina Sadowsky who went to Camp Hillcroft?" And I DM'd him back and I said, "Are you the Eric Siegel who kissed me in woodshop?" And it turns out it was the first boy I ever kissed when I was 12. He wildly now is a constitutional law expert and writes books about the Supreme Court. So like incredibly, timely person to know right now. But he has a podcast called Supreme Myths. And I did an episode with him talking, about everything from writing to law. But it was just the wildest thing. He showed up on my screen because there was a video component and it kind of looked the same. I was like, you haven't changed since we were 12. But so that's just a COVID lemonade thing. But I say to my publisher all the time, and I think this is why I am so well liked at my publisher. I say, I will do anything. I say, I will go on any podcast. I will interview with anyone. I will write any article you think is a good idea. I host contests, like I did with I've done 2 short story contests now, one on the subject of secrets and the other on lying. They're 500 words, the winner gets a bag of swag from me and published on my dispatch. So some exposure. I've been really excited because both times I've run the contest, complete strangers have won, which, because, sometimes when you're putting out all that stuff, contests or social media, that's the other thing. I do so much social media. This year, knowing that in 2020, I was going to have 2 books out, both The Empty Bed, which is the second burial book, and Convince Me 8 months later, right? Because I had January and August release. I did invest in a marketing person. And this was really an interesting learn for me. My agents advised me against hiring a publicist. Because they said that in an election year, and who knew it would also be a pandemic year, that the news cycle was going to be so fast and furious that money spent on publicity for books was probably a waste. I don't know if you guys know this, but the trends in buying have been largely political books. Fiction has really been hit. It's largely been political books. And they say that people aren't even buying them to read them. They're buying them to signal affiliation and support, right? So hopefully that will begin to change a little. But what was I talking about? I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I don't know. Anyone remember? No. So I guess it wasn't that interesting. But so I see. So I got distracted by another question, which is what swag have I tried and how? Oh, so I was just talking about all the things that I've done, and I will do anything. I tell them I will do anything, and actually now that sort of the push is over, and I did another podcast yesterday, but like basically everything that I had booked is done. Now I'm gonna talk to them about what I can do in a second wave on my own. As I was saying, so I did hire a marketing person this year instead of a publicist because they said publicity is going to be wasted. And so what I took about a third of the money a publicist would have asked, and I hired someone who did some really crucial things for me. We completely redid my website, which I had built on my own, which had that little bit of that look, and now it's really beautiful. I urge you to go check it out. We set up an autoresponder so that if people subscribe to my dispatch, they begin to get an automatic series of emails from me introducing my different books and giving a different window into what I'm doing. We set up something called Later so that all of my social media, I can stack it up in advance and just have a program that releases it so that I can have a steady stream without having to worry about doing it every day because it's such a job. We set up a color palette for me so that the creation of social media would be more cohesive. We did a lot of things to just enhance my marketing as opposed. And one of the really important things she said to me about my website, and if you're building websites, I urge you to think about this. So the website that I had built was a good advertisement for a publisher, a good publisher to say, oh, this is a person worth supporting, but it wasn't fan based, right? So it had sort of served its purpose and that it highlighted my Hollywood connections and it highlighted my educational connections and it highlighted where I had been asked to speak and all of that, but it wasn't fan interactive. And so that's why I started things, decided to double down on things like the short story contest or the art gallery, because I wanted to make it more interactive with my community. Later is fantastic, Hawthorne. Really a gift in my life. Then also I have a question about what swag have I tried and how has it worked out? So I did invest in swag. I didn't do any for Convince Me because the place where I've really found swag to be useful is at conferences. And obviously you can't hand out swag at virtual conferences, which is all I've been doing. Probably my best investment was also my cheapest because I've tried everything from notepads to tote bags, notebooks to tote bags to candles. But the best investment was actually lens cloth covers that I did for the empty bed with just the cover of the book on it. They were I found a place that I didn't use like a Vistaprint or a commercial place. I had a friend of a friend who runs a company called Jack Nadell International. Any of you could use it if you wanted to create swag for anything, but it's much cheaper than Vistaprint or any of those places because it's that's what they do and they're not charging you a big premium. So like, for example, I did tote bags, which I was able to get for, $3 a piece as opposed to $12 a piece, right? It's a big saving. But I found that tote bags are kind of ubiquitous. People have enough tote bags. They don't want them. I found that people like the candles and the little notebooks like as prizes, but that they weren't really what I wanted, which was to have a repeated image. And so I'm looking around to see if I have one of those lens cloths, but I did these little lens cloths. They're about 6 by 6. They're for your glasses or your computer. They were cheap as hell. I brought them to Thriller Fest the summer before the summer, and people loved them. I could not give them out fast enough. And so many authors said to me, oh, I'm going to have these next year. I thought I was going to start a trend because they were cheap. And there's something that everybody uses. Everyone, you say, do you need a lens cloth? Everyone goes, yes. And the most important thing about marketing is they say that, I learned this also at that Thriller Fest conference, you need somewhere around 5 to 7 impressions just to have awareness of a book title, because there's so much. There are 3 million titles on Amazon. How do you distinguish yourself? So they say that you need 5 to 7 impressions just to get awareness. What is better than giving someone something that they will look at every time, even if it's subliminal, that they put their glasses on, right? So I began to think, what could I do that is, both cheap and and effective. And I found the lens cloths were the best. So I was actually just thinking about what I was going to do for this summer, if I was going to redo that for Convince Me, or if I was going to try to think of something that was sort of parallel. And then everything, I was supposed to got shut down. I was going to be at Thriller Fest. I was going to be at Killer Nashville for the first time, which I was really excited about because I've always gotten great support for my books there. And so couldn't, and I go anywhere. As I said, I'm kind of a, conference slut. I'll go anywhere I'm asked. So I thought that was probably the best use I've had of a swag item.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Yes, it's back to the agent. Excuse me. And I think I thought about asking you because you have been in television and film, you've been a producer. I have a play agent, which I just discovered last year there was even such a thing, but I do have one. And since everything's dark in theater, she's concentrating on my work, going to producers because so much streaming going on, people need content and stuff. And plus, since Black people are popular for the time being, she said, well, let's hit it while it's hot. And so I mean, is that something that producers, because I know they adapt from a lot of books, but I don't see a lot of adapt for plays. So is that something that's really worth pursuing?
Yeah,
well,
I think
pursuing, but.
That's a great question. And you're really kind of in the catbird seat there, Crystal. You're right. Not only because, our Black folk incredibly popular right now, which I'll just be candid. My manager is Black. And I tell you, he's the only person I've ever felt who I have had a partnership with in my career, but he's just so funny about it because he's like, they're like, he goes, there are 3 Black guys who do what I do in town, and I am so popular right now. It's just very, very true. So there's that. And, God bless that, honestly, because we need to change the whole landscape. But beyond that, playwrights are always looked at very favorably in Hollywood, because the one thing that is true about playwrights is they have that authenticity of voice that people are looking for. And if you look at, my favorite thing that I have watched, well, 2 things. I'm going to make 2 recommendations to you for during the pandemic. One is the Trial of the Chicago 7, which is on Netflix, and which is written by excellent, right? So Aaron Sorkin, playwright, started with A Few Good Men, which was a Broadway play, and that catapulted him to a huge Hollywood career, right? Diana Sun is a playwright I worked with, who's now early on in her career because I recognized the voice in her plays, and now she's a huge television writer. Because I think that, in Hollywood, there's always this sort of tension, right? There's huge money involved. So they want someone who's experienced at the job, right? And at the same time, they need to find someone who can have something original to say. And that is always the push-pull tension. But the desire for that original voice, which is often seen by playwrights, is always there. And if you don't know about it, Crystal, you might want to look at, go to the humanitasprize.org.
What is it?
It's called, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
There's an organization called the Humanitas Prize, and they give awards. I've been involved. Oh, I sent it to Janet privately by mistake. Hang on. It's everybody. So this organization, they give awards for writing that sort of, that changes the dialogue. It examines the human condition, right? So for last few years, I've run their college competition where we give 20 grand to students, 2 20 grand prizes, one for drama, one for comedy, which is a life-changing thing for a lot of people. But they also have a playwrights prize and a playwriting program. And it's a great way, to have your material seen by a very, very high level of Hollywood players, because it's all top Hollywood writers that are involved in that organization. So that's a sort of a good way in.
I'll follow that up. Thank you.
Yeah, when you guys were talking about, attending BoucherCon and all of that, I think that all of that is so important. It's like participating in contests and seeking out what areas, anything that you can get either information or, a leap up. I think that's all exactly right. It's so important. Okay, I see one more question. Quick thoughts on kicking writer's block. Okay. All right, well, here, let me share this with you. This may be controversial. I don't believe in writer's block. I think if you don't know what to write, you just haven't asked yourself the right questions yet. But let me clarify that by saying, I don't always sit down and know exactly what I'm going to write, but I feel like if I don't, it's because I haven't asked myself the questions. So I ask myself the questions. What do I need to accomplish in the next scene? Have I accomplished what I needed to in this scene? Can I add more to this scene? Have I filled my obligation to myself of advancing plot, story, theme, and character in this scene? Can I do better? Can I, highlight my theme in some way? So I go back and I just question myself. I don't believe in writer's block because I think that we're all too hard on ourselves. I think some days you sit down and the work is good and 15 pages flow out and you don't even realize that you haven't gone to the bathroom in 5 hours. And some days you sit down and you end up playing words with friends for 3 hours before you get, a couple of lines in. But, that is just process. You can't, I don't believe in setting page goals, and I don't believe in, like if you want to do NaNoWriMo, I think that's in November, fantastic. But to me, that doesn't work because I feel it just makes me feel a kind of pressure, and I have enough pressure in my life. So that doesn't. Then I feel like if I've let myself down. So I don't commit to count or pages. What I commit to is time. I commit to myself the blocks of time that I'm going to mark off in any given week that are going to be for me, for writing. And that is hard because I have a lot of other responsibilities. And frankly, I'm doing a ton for the election, and have been. I've been working with a group. We've been creating of writers, musicians, and editors, and we've been creating content for different campaigns. And so I've been, so I don't know. I frankly don't have time for writer's block. So I just commit to the time that I'm going to devote to writing. And some days it's good and some days it's bad. And I just sort of say to myself, all right, I'm going to be compassionate with myself about that. I think that, and again, if I feel stuck, I just go, all right, you just don't know what questions. I started a new chapter yesterday on the book I'm working on now. And I was like, all right, I don't know what happens here. I read through what I had done the day before, which is how I always start. And then I go, okay, I don't know what happens here. And I got up and I folded some laundry and I thought about what happened there. And then I got back in and I was like, okay, now I know what happens here. And then I started, right? That wasn't block. I got the laundry done and solved the problem. So, doubly efficient. But that's just about, because I think that as soon as you start saying that you're blocked, you set yourself up for anxiety. And writing I don't think it always should be joyous. In the podcast I did yesterday, the interviewer was also a writer, so she hasn't been able to write during the pandemic because for her process has to come from a place of joy and optimism, and she hasn't been able to find that. And I was very empathetic to her, but I also, because I understand that, and I couldn't write at all for the first 6 weeks, and I was panicking first 6 weeks of lockdown because I thought this is how I process everything, and if I don't write, my brain's going to explode. What's going to happen to me? It's going to get so ugly, right? And then, then I was owed a check, and that for a deadline, and that became a very good motivator, and I started writing. But I will tell you that I recently reread what I wrote on that deadline in that time, and it was terrible. And I was grateful for it because it got me writing again. But I looked at the work recently and I went, that was just bad. My head was not in a good place. So it's not like I don't respect the feeling for the head to be in a good place, but I also feel like for me, I'm a rage writer. That's the other thing that I think is different. I don't need to, I do believe that in looking in the darkness in my books, then I'm also trying to examine what makes us whole and light and better, right? That's why I dive dark into that, because I want people to think about what breaks them, what hurts us, how we hurt each other, right? How we can be better. So I really do believe that in diving into the darkness, I'm also looking at the light. But, obviously whatever we're going through really affects us. When I started privacy, the book was somewhat different. But I sold it after several weeks, and I ended up refining the proposal several times with Ballantine, because as we were in lockdown and my perspective changed and shifted, and I began to feel like there are other things that I need to talk about, the book shifted. Again, I'm long-winded. I apologize. That was a long-winded answer. So, I don't know. Do you guys have any other questions for me? I'm happy to answer anything because I have no filter, as you might have noticed. What is the meaning of life? I actually have been thinking about that quite a lot, Stephen, and I have an answer for you. I do, because I have really used this time to be very self-reflective, and as I think we should. And I've decided I don't know exactly what I want to do for the rest of my life, but I do know how I want to feel. And I know that in order to feel the way I want to feel, two things are going to matter. One is that I have meaningful and purposeful work in my life, and two, that I have meaningful and purposeful relationships. And that is the meaning of life for me right now, those two things.
That is a perfect answer, Nina. That really is.
Well, thank you. But that's really been, I have had this conversation with a lot of people. I talked to a lot of people in the course of my, many roles in life. And I really feel this, that the people, that everyone, it's an opportunity right now for a reset. It's an opportunity to take a look at what's important. And if you're not doing that, then I think you're sadly oblivious that we're in a real moment of change. And I really hope for the better. I really hope that we've peeled off a lot of what's ugly and not working in our country, and that we're moving forward to a better, more loving place. Because, as I started out my morning by tweeting, vote love, that's where we should, all be. So, but thank you guys. I said, I did answer the meaning of life, which I thought you think you were going to stump me on, Stephen, but but any other hardballs, I'll do my best. But I urge you, check out my website. If you have art, send it to me. I'll put it up. If you, sign up for my dispatch, I try to keep it entertaining. I think Kathy can vouch for that. She gets it. And keep writing. I sold my first book in my 50s, and I had done a lot of other things. And I recognize that my Hollywood connections gave me a little glitter in the publishing community as a sales tool. And it's true, I have been able to sell my books for TV probably more easily than the average writer, because of my connections. But those books haven't been made into shows yet, although I'm optimistic for the Burial books. But they, Just Fall, died in development. And this is actually hellacious, but when they passed on it, they told me they had just greenlit 2 shows with female protagonists and didn't think they had room on the schedule for a third. Thank you for that laughter, Crystal, because that's just bullshit, right? Like,
Yes.
right? It's just, but that's why Hollywood is, really challenging, because you can do your really good work and have everyone like your work and tell you they like your work and then have it not get made. So. Question, do I write with an eye toward Hollywood for your books? I didn't for the first one. For Just Fall, I was writing to escape Hollywood, although I did think that if I did, in the back of my mind, thought, well, if anything happens, then I own the IP, right? So I did kind of think about it. And then when it sold, I was, grateful, because I got another check for, something that I had already been paid for, in a sense. I had to rewrite, I got paid to write a script, but they also optioned the book, and that was a win-win, I thought. I've also done a lot. Let me just say this: I've done a lot of writing where I have not been paid, and I am intensely, or as I talked about before, I was paid very little or stiffed for jobs I did in the worst of my life. So I'm very grateful I'm getting paid to write right now. I consider that an unbelievable blessing. So, but I write a little bit towards an eye towards Hollywood now, because I recognize, partly because I can't help it. I've worked in the business for so long that I can't help but also think about who's the demographic and what's the marketing, and, what I think visually. I actually think about what departments as a producer I would have to bring to a scene when I'm trying to structure the scene. I think about what would the weather be look like? What would would I have to have, what would the art department be doing, and the cinematographer, like how can I use those things I've learned in making movies to try to make my writing feel more visual and rich. So it always goes, I think that they both serve each other all the time. But I did make the decision that because Hollywood is such a capricious mistress, that I am primarily an author and an educator. And if things happen in film and TV, it's a bonus. Because for many, many years, I rode the dragon of hope and disappointment, both as a producer and as a writer. And, that doesn't mean I haven't had great success. I've made 5 movies. That's a lot. I developed many more. I worked with some major stars, Meg Ryan, Jennifer Lopez, Matthew McConaughey, Kiefer Sutherland, Winona Ryder. I had a real ride on that Hollywood side. And I've gotten as a writer to know, wonderful community of writers. I belong to a group called the Wolf Pack, which is all female showrunners, writers, and producers who just are about community and mentorship. And, I know and love wonderful people from that side of my life, but it's a very, very tough business. And so I do think about it, but I consider it a bonus, not an investment. There were many years when I was living check to check. And that's the other thing, Hollywood doesn't pay you in a timely way. That was when I got paid, when I signed with Random House and checks emerged like clockwork, I was amazed. And then I found out that when Bertelsmann bought Random House, they did a survey, what was the chief complaint? And one of them was timeliness of payment. And they instituted a system within Random House where if you make an offer, you get like timed for how quickly you close it. And if you have to issue a check, it's like regulated. And, this project I'm working on for TV, I've had to chase the company for money for 6 months sometimes before they release the money. It's due, it's owed, and you bill and, you invoice, and 6 months later, you're still trying to get them to release a check. When I was living on those kind of payments exclusively with children, it was heart and throat all the time. So education, which started, as I said, sort of as my side hustle, became, my security. And then, from there, publishing became my security. And, Hollywood can be a capricious mistress because I only have to visit her on the weekends. So I don't like that. Do I get royalties? If my books earn out their advances, yes. I have a standard deal. So it's an advance against royalties. So again, if you have no more questions, I'm going to go write because that's my favorite thing to do on Saturday mornings, which it is here in LA. And, again, you can reach me through my website. I pride myself that I get back to everyone who emails eventually. I like to have connection with my readers. If you haven't read me, please do. If you like my books, post positive reviews on Amazon or Goodreads because it really helps an author. Use bookshop.org or IndieBound to support local bookstores. I want to say that too, because that's something I believe in strongly. Stay safe, stay well, wear masks, and vote. Go vote.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. So nice to see you. Happy to spread the word. If I was good, I'm happy to go talk to anyone, as you can tell.
All right.
All right. Thank
No,
you.
this has been
you
really
so
good.
much. Yeah,
Thank you
it's
so
great.
much. Bye.